My name is Dr. Callum Hartley and I'm a lecturer at Lancaster University, and I'm joined with...
I'm Molly Lee and I'm a student at Lancaster University studying developmental disorders.
I think we're going to be having an interesting discussion about your experiences as someone with autism, and I suppose a good way to start would be to think about what is autism? In a kind of, as a clinical category and in a diagnostic sense, autism is a developmental disorder that's characterised by difficulties in social interaction, in communication, alongside restricted range of interests, repetitive behaviours. It's a spectrum disorder, and what that means is that the population of people who are diagnosed with autism are characterised by a huge amount of variability in terms of both intellectual functioning and the way in which behaviours are presented. There are some people with autism who have incredibly high IQ and with incredible language skills and real expert level skills in a range of abilities. But equally there are other people diagnosed with autism who have quite severe intellectual difficulties. There might be general learning disabilities or specific learning disabilities, and also profound impairments in the acquisition of language. Some children with ASD and even some adults with ASD are minimally verbal with very few functional words in productive language. So, as someone with autism, how do you feel about that?
Well, I've met an awful lot of people with autism. I am autistic and I know mostly autistic girls, but that's a smaller category of people diagnosed with autism. I found that my autism has lent itself to an interest in the disorder itself. And so that's where my research has come from and where I want to carry on into research on. And my diagnosis took a very long time. And so I know typically, as it's a developmental disorder, most people diagnosed it are diagnosed very young. They're diagnosed prior to the age of 5, normally around starting school when difficulties become apparent. But I was diagnosed at 17, which is a very late diagnosis. And it took a year for me to get my diagnosis. And it wasn't because I didn't show typical signs and symptoms of autism when I was young, but just that nobody picked up on it. So I know that a very early sign is delayed language acquisition. And I didn't speak until I was over 3 years old, which was suggested by some people to be a symptom of autism, but it was dismissed by well-meaning caretakers who just wanted the best for me.
Why do you think that was then?
Why it was dismissed?
Yeah.
I think because there's an idea of what autism is, and it's a scary thought when people don't know very much about it, to have somebody in your life diagnosed with something that everything you know about it seems very scary, and you don't want to limit your child's options. And so if you have this diagnosis attached to you, and you don't know very much about it, it sort of sounds like maybe they're not going to do as well in life and things like that. And so the idea was that I would just catch up. And I did. Until the demands of the world outstrips what I could cope with and what I could handle. So that happened around high school for me. Primary school, fine. Everything seemed okay. And so it seemed justifiable that I was left be. But a very common story with the autistic people I know is that around high school age, the demands go up. The social demand especially. High school is a very social time, and if you lack social skills, it's going to impact on you. And so that's something that I found. I was struggling with my time management, I was struggling with my social skills, and it all started to pile up at that point.
When you say that you had some difficulties with social skills, can you tell us a bit more about what specifically you mean?
Well, it was a case of I was kind of an odd child anyway. I had very odd interests, and that's an autistic thing, to have odd interests. And I was very focused on studying, and I liked to read in class and things like that. And so certain people would want to tease me about it, and often tease about it in backhanded ways,
Right.
and I wouldn't pick up on that, and I often didn't understand when people were being mean to me, and also people just thought that I spoke strangely and that my facial expressions were strange, because oftentimes my facial expression wouldn't match up with the emotion I was intending to convey, and essentially I sort of gave off a bit of a vibe that people shouldn't speak to me, I guess.
Right.
And so then when I attempted to talk to people, I was treated as strange, as weird, and I wouldn't understand why.
Right.
That was a big part of high school for me, not understanding why things were happening. It felt like everybody knew so many things that I didn't get, and it felt like they'd all been taught something that I'd missed out on. That they understood how to talk to one another, and they understood implied meanings and things like that, and I never got it, and it made it very difficult to talk to a lot of people, because it felt like there was a gap between what I was saying and then this moment where they realised that what I was saying was different, that I didn't come from the same language, the same understanding that they came from, and there was just this gap in between us, and it felt a little bit like there was a gap between me and just about everybody else, and so I sort of internalised that I was just sort of bad at being a human, and I didn't know how to function correctly, rather than just functioning differently, because I didn't have a name for it.
So you were aware of some of the difficulties you're experiencing in these social settings. Did you use any sort of strategies, if you were aware of these difficulties, any kind of compensatory mechanisms or strategies to navigate around?
Mostly I had a few friends that I knew for a very long time that I stuck with. I didn't make very many new friends in high school. I didn't make very many new friends in college. So I stuck with people and tried to keep my head down, because that was the only thing that I could do. And I ended up asking for a lot of help from teachers, because in my head I was like, authority figure, this is where I go to for help. So I did ask a lot. I did ask for help from my teachers, but I mostly just tried to stick to the social rules that I did know. And high school was a very hard and bad time for me. So it really badly impacted my mental health in high school. Okay.
Do you feel like any of your teachers were aware that you might have something like autism? Because the way you were describing it and the way that you were behaving, choosing to read in class or read, I mentioned on the train on the way up, reading at the side of the playground rather than playing. From a teacher's perspective, it looks like you're just a really studious pupil, right? Did any of them give any sort of indication that they're aware that there might be more than just dealing with a studious pupil?
Not really. I, at one point, spoke to my special educational needs coordinator in my high school, and he dismissed the fact that somebody thought I had autism, because it was suggested at the end of high school. Somebody who I'd spoken to a lot of professionals in my time in high school, and in my final year, when they weren't exactly sure how to help, somebody was brought in who wasn't a doctor or a practitioner of any sort really, just did some behavioural help with some students. And she had a meeting with me and just took into account all of my behaviour just when I was speaking to her. No, not really any background, just just when I was speaking to her, because I wouldn't look at her, and the way I was talking was kind of stilted and odd, and everything that I was describing having struggles with, she could pinpoint where they all converged. And so she suggested that I may have autism because the patterns of behaviours that I had were ones that she found in her other autistic students.
I see.
But then when that was brought up and I needed a year-long assessment from lots of different people, one of which was the Senko at my high school, and he dismissed it when you don't have that. And when he filled out the forms for me, I went through them with some people who knew me, and they basically said he's lying. Either he doesn't know you whatsoever, or he is lying on these forms because these answers don't make sense for your behaviour.
Right.
So it wasn't something that seemed to be a common thing that people thought was the possible option. So
do you think then that it was a case of maybe a lack of awareness in that particular educational setting that you were in, and that people... Did you know if there were other pupils in the school that had autism?
Actually, the very first person who thought I was autistic was another autistic boy.
Okay, that's really interesting.
He came up to me and just simply asked me, what type of autism do you have? After knowing me for maybe a year. And I was 14 and I just went, I don't have autism because I didn't know. And he very simply just went, yes, you do. And that was before anybody else had noticed. And so I know that there were some other students, but I don't think there was very much awareness, and mostly what was focused on in our school was behavioural difficulties.
Right.
And since I didn't have any behavioural difficulties, I wasn't really a problem student. I didn't flag up on anything. I was just a well-behaved student, and they knew that I was having some issues, but they put it down to general anxiety. And so I ended up getting exam accommodations for being an anxious person.
Right.
So I ended up getting some of the things that I needed through other means, which I'm grateful for, and it was a very good thing for me to have extra time. And it turned out that I had multiple reasons for needing extra time, but at that point that was as far as it went.
So how did it make you feel when people were first suggesting that you might have ASD?
Relieved.
Okay.
Because I spent years thinking that I was just bad at being a human, that everybody else could do this stuff that I couldn't do, and I didn't know why. So I was like, maybe they just have this aptitude for it that I don't have. And then when somebody suggested autism, and I did my reading, and the people in my life did their reading, and everyone sort of came to the same conclusion of, this seems like it actually fits this multitude of problems that you're having. I felt relieved. I felt happy that there was an answer, that I wasn't just bad at things, that my brain worked differently, not worse.
Did you know much about autism when it was first brought up to you?
No.
And so it was all about this kind of exploratory process, doing your homework, and then just realising how well the kind of criteria and characteristics match onto your own forms of behaviour.
Basically, yeah. I did a lot of reading, and I looked up lots of symptoms and all the sort of assessments that they had, all the common symptoms that come up, and everything made a lot of sense. I was like, oh, that's why I do that thing. More than anything, it just, actually ended up making sense, rather than, oh, I'm different and strange than my friends. I'm like, maybe I am different and strange from my friends, but there's a lot of people who are different and strange in the same way that I am.
I see. So I suppose going back to the journey you mentioned, someone who clearly had some familiarity with autism suggested that was the case, and then your Senko thought about it and thought otherwise. What happened next then?
Well, I was leaving high school. I was going into college, and so it was a very weird time to have to start a process like that. But I had to have speech and language assessment. I had to have an assessment from the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, and a general doctor's assessment who specialised in that sort of thing.
And over how long was this period?
It took a year. It started when I was 16, it finished when I was 17. I got diagnosed in January. I remember getting the letter because I was on my way out and I picked up the letter and I was like, oh, I don't have time to process this, because it was such a big change to my life. Even though a few months in, we all figured out, okay, she's autistic. We all know this. It just mattered if she's going to get that piece of paper. So I ended up seeing the educational psychologist at college, and I needed the diagnosis for reasons to do with my exams, basically, because emotionally and things like that, support-wise from my family and friends, the piece of paper didn't matter because we all understood that this is what's going on now. But to get things like exam arrangements and teachers to understand that I have specialist needs, I needed a piece of paper. But the educational psychologists at college were really helpful, and because my diagnosis wasn't coming through fast enough, tested essentially for all the subset symptoms of autism, processing problems, whether I could read on white paper, which I can't, which I didn't know was a problem that I had until I got to college and they went, do you want to try these filters? And I was like, wait, words don't look like that to other people? Because I didn't know, because I don't live in anybody else's body. I live in my own body and my own brain, and this is the only way I've ever known. And so I got some arrangements from that, basically, from having below average processing and just other general things that actually really come under the autism umbrella, but an autism diagnosis takes a long time and a lot of people to talk to you about it. And so by halfway through college I had my diagnosis, which was a relief, and it meant that I've been able to access services at university as well. And so going through disability services and getting DSA and things like that, which has been really helpful. So yeah, I had a year-long set of appointments with different people who sort of went into why they thought it hadn't been caught, which was essentially that I have a lot of compensatory strategies that make up for the difficulties that I have. So speech and language therapist actually assessed me and assessed all of the typical things and the typical signs and symptoms, and all of my test results came within the normal range. And she wrote a note on it to a doctor and said, ignore these test results, this child is autistic. What's happening is that my actual intellect level puts me at the top of all those sorts of answers. I am in the top range of those. So with my difficulties, they pull it down to within a normal bound. So it doesn't look like I have anything going on. I'm just a normal child. But what's actually happening is that I have figured out how to get around those sorts of tests. I know where my difficulties lay, and I've spent so many years trying to catch up with everyone that I've found my way around it.
So that's really interesting, of course, and I suppose that's the importance of not taking the final value from any kind of assessment just at face value. It could be that two children reach the same point, but the route or the pathway that they take to get to that point can be very, very different. And it sounds like, you were using kind of an atypical strategies and pathways to reach a score that was, at least on the surface, masking any underlying difference. Yeah,
I spent a lot of time figuring out how to present a certain way, rather than actually being a certain way.
And did you use any of those sorts of compensatory strategies in social situations that you're aware of?
I think so. I've met people who've done it more than me. I've met certain people who practice eye contact in the mirror and practice their facial expressions to understand how they're looking when they're saying things. I've never done that, not because I don't struggle with it, but because I've got decent people who accept that sometimes my face doesn't match my words. And I still am very bad at eye contact and things like that, but I've learned certain ways to fake it, and I have to sort of turn on and off my social mask for when it's necessary. It is tiring. It is very tiring to try and present a certain way and try and keep my body language in check and try and look attentive, because typically developing people will only accept one way of looking attentive. Look in your direction, don't fiddle with anything, and nod and make appropriate noises at certain points. That's the only way you're paying attention to someone. Whereas I can be listening to someone and in fact listen a lot better if I'm not looking at them, because I have information processing difficulties. I think autism mostly is a processing disorder. That's how I think of it, because you struggle with emotion processing, you struggle with information processing, anything like that. And so I can't do the visual processing and the auditory processing at the same time. And so I don't want to look at people when they're talking to me. I've learned the way that the certain social situations in which I am required to do certain things. This is something that I'm pretty sure is implicit to a lot of people. They don't need to think about it, but I do. I have to think about what level of formality certain things require of me, and then plan my socialising to that level.
So what you said to begin with was really interesting, I think, that it's like putting on a social mask. So it's very much a conscious effort, putting on a face and making, I suppose, a real explicit choice to present yourself in a certain way, and paying attention to the details in which you're presenting yourself. And I suppose that's perhaps what's different when we're thinking about typically developing children and adults who spontaneously and naturally engage in social situations and interactions, I guess.
There's also the difference in girls and boys with autism.
Okay.
And so social masking is a big thing with girls. It's part of why they think that girls get diagnosed later, because even in typically developing children, they are better and score better in these sort of social ways and social reproductivity and mirroring and things like that. They score better. And so then when you come to an atypical population like autism, the girls score better, and all it does is mask the problems. It just leads themselves to looking and acting like they think they're supposed to in a way that boys don't. And so if a boy isn't masking, they're going to get picked up on really quickly that this child is atypical, and therefore get diagnosed because everybody's paying attention to it. But if a girl is trying to fit in and trying to just replicate what is being shown to her by other people, then they won't get picked up on. They go under the radar, and the way we think about autism is very male-centric.
So from your perspective, in order for a girl to be diagnosed at a very young age, like a boy, do you feel like it's the case that they have to show quite severe symptomology, impaired general intellectual development, severe language impairments, the kinds of real obvious red flags that are often picked up in boys with autism?
Yeah, because of the autism specification, the autism symptomology, it's all geared around boys. The original studies were done on boys, and the ratio is still very highly tipped towards boys. And when you don't look into the ratio, you just find more and more evidence that this is a male disorder. When actually, if you look into the ratio and you look into the why is this coming across that way, that you find a problem in the diagnosis criteria.
Yeah.
And you find the way it's written, it's all to do with boys. It's all to do with what is a typical male symptom. And so when practitioners are looking at the symptoms, they see them in boys. And if you don't look very deeply, you find other explanations for things that are autism when you see them presented in girls. So if you get so many classic signs of autism, like the repetitive behaviours, people will suggest OCD, because OCD is commonly found in girls, and autism at this point not commonly found in girls, but that number is rising. And that number isn't rising because we've suddenly got an epidemic of autistic girls, it's because we know more.
Yes.
And autism as an epidemic is a very scary word, and autism is not a scary condition to have. And so to get diagnosed early, you need a learning disability. You need an intellectual disability. You need things where your language acquisition is heavily delayed and then doesn't catch up.
Yep.
You need something so obvious that people have to pay attention, because if they don't have to, they typically won't.
Well, what you said about the kind of gender imbalance in the diagnosis is really interesting, and it could almost be a cyclical type of effect. So the kind of well-documented ratio is 4-to-1, right? And if that is as high profile as it is, and medical practitioners are aware of that, then of course they're going to be more likely to think of autism as a potential explanation for the behaviours that a young boy might be presenting with than a young girl. And be, as you say, be less likely to consider ASD as that sort of explanation for young girls.
And also, some of the research that I've read has suggested that the restricted interests of girls don't seem so abnormal often. Because I know that one of my special interests as a child was a certain band, and that wasn't seen as strange because that's something that lots of girls have interest in. But when you look deeper, something that I used to do was memorise the track lists of CDs, and I could recite from memory the track list in order from 1989 through to 2009 easily, because that was something I found fun. And that isn't typical, but on the surface it was just, oh, my daughter really likes this band. She goes and buys the CDs and she buys the t-shirts, and that seems like typically developing behaviour when you don't look into it that far. And so this idea that we have of autism, of trains and physics and things like that, that is a harmful stereotype, because it means that people who have more typical interest to their gender or to their age, the intensity isn't looked at. It is just, oh, they're interested in this thing. This thing is totally normal for that age and that gender. And so it doesn't flag anything up. No,
and I think definitely in the public sphere, it is definitely considered as a male type of disorder. And you just think of kind of characters that are in fiction and media who are representing the autism stereotype. I can't think of any that are female.
I also can't.
They're all male, right?
Yeah.
So if it's embedded in pop culture and there's this awareness in a medical sense, then it's probably kind of the self-fulfilling cycle almost in terms of and maintaining this imbalance. So obviously you're well aware of the difference and discrepancies in diagnosis between males and females with autism. Is that something that's inspired your pursuit of psychology as a degree?
Very much so. What I want to study further, because I've already started studying it, is the gender differences. My dissertation was on how gender affects the presentation and diagnosis, because diagnosis rates are so there's so much discrepancy in the gender, but also the age. When my research was on typically university students, but also everyone that I studied had finished secondary education. So there's some bias there anyway, because everybody has managed to handle their symptoms well enough to go through school. But the difference in age of diagnosis between girls and boys is dramatic. It's so strange to see on paper, but it averages out around 5 for boys, and it's well into the teens for girls,
right,
if not older. There are people who, now that autism is becoming more aware, like there's more awareness of autism, and now that we're becoming more aware of girls with autism, much older, going back and getting a diagnosis that makes sense of their entire life. And that's something that they're having to find out in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, because we didn't know. And I don't want to continue to not know and have people who could be diagnosed now, if people are paying attention and if people know what autism looks like in girls, to have to wait and then not be able to access things that help, not be able to understand themselves and also access services, which is something that only a diagnosis can do. And also there's research that shows that autism and trans identities are linked.
Okay.
So there's a higher than typical rate of trans identities in people with autism than the general population. And that's very, very new. There's not very much research into it, but it was significant enough that somebody paid attention and then did the research and found that it was still significant, even if you take out the bias of it.
So was that gender identity something you integrated into your research project?
Yes, I looked at that, and it was not particularly significant, but there were, even in my small sample, there were more than 1 or 2 people who described themselves in either binary trans identities, so born male at birth and transitioning to female, or non-binary, so anything other than male or female. There were more non-binary identities than trans-binary identities as well. And so there's a lot of anecdotal talk about gender and autism and transgender ideas, because gender is essentially a social idea, and if you have problems with social processing, it would make sense that is something that's impacted.
Yeah. And I suppose being a student at university, are there provisions and support structures at the university that help with that kind of social identity and skills, and provide opportunities for socialisation?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely something that's becoming better. In my time at university, an Autism Social Society has been founded between when I started and now in my 4th year. So that's something that's just happened now. But more disability services are becoming more aware of the differences and the variations, which I think is important, because if we only have one idea of autism, we only have one idea of how to help. And so if someone doesn't struggle with the basics of socialising, what if they struggle with implied meaning? And what if they struggle with sarcasm? How do we help them? How do we talk to them? And not just, this is how a conversation works, which is a lot of what social skills classes are.
Yes.
It's the very basics of it. But if you're a girl and you've spent your life masking, oftentimes the basics are covered because you had to learn it. You had to learn it to carry on. You had to learn it to get through school. And so it's these intricacies that are being missed out on, and that there's also a gap for in terms of support.
So I suppose just going back to your research, so you were investigating or working with a population of students with ASD for the most part who'd gone through education, and you were interested in the age at which they were diagnosed, differences between males and females, gender identity, Did you look at anything else?
I looked at comorbid disorders because most people with autism also have some other disorder, whether it's a mental health condition or it's ADHD or a learning disability. The only person I found with a learning disability was female, but the majority had some form of comorbid diagnosis, especially ADHD or a mental health condition.
And did you take account of whether they were diagnosed before the ASD or did they come after the ASD?
Yes, I looked at that, and oftentimes the mental health diagnosis especially come before the autism diagnosis, which there is some research that shows that social masking leads to mental health problems because it's a taxing situation to find yourself in.
And did you also take consideration of differences in the severity of your classic autism symptoms, as well as these differences in social masking?
Well, I looked at the autism quotient, which is one of the most standard ways of measuring symptomology, and there were general differences in how high people scored on certain questions. So things like sensory problems were significantly more likely to be found in females. And certain cognitive symptoms. But the sensory one I found very interesting because it's only very recently started to come under the actual diagnosis label. And so lots of people have already thought that sensory problems were linked to autism, but it was very recently added to the actual diagnostic criteria. And so if a girl was coming in with some symptoms of the diagnostic criteria of autism, but really struggling with the sensory problems, that would come as a separate problem up until very recently.
Yeah, absolutely. For the longest time, it was just considered a sort of an extra or a tag on. And it's only in the most recent versions of the diagnostic manuals that sensory processing has been integrated under the restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests sphere of difficulties associated with ASD. Did you find any differences in social masking, either in terms of frequency or the way in which males and females engaged in that behaviour?
What I found was that they typically started at around the same time, but girls would mask either more often or more severely. And so that's what prior research has found, and it seems like it makes the most sense in terms of just looking at the data and thinking, why is this happening?
Well, you could certainly see how that might contribute to later in age diagnosis, and certainly less common or less frequent diagnoses in females than males. So that's some really interesting findings, I think. Thank you, Molly, for talking so openly and honestly about your experiences as not only a student with autism who's faced difficulties in your journey through education, but also as a female with autism, someone who's being able to shed light on the differences in experience and social attitudes towards males and females with autism. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Thank you very much.